Okay, so everything, all living things can be eaten, and just like Kiyerek Asev, just like the vegetation, just like the green herbage. So that's the upgrade after. That's the upgrade that happens after the flood. And we asked last week. We asked, is this something good or something bad? And of course, like everything else in Judaism, it depends who you ask. And we have two opposing views. One view is that it's actually a downgrade, a spiritual downgrade, an ethical downgrade. And the other approach is that it's actually an upgrade. And if you want to say it's a downgrade, you will say that because Adam and Eve were created in the perfect world, when they were in the Garden of Eden, which is a place of peace, serenity, holiness, spirituality, they didn't need to take away life to eat. And therefore, they just ate the vegetation. And the fact that now after the flood, God says you can eat any living thing, that is a recognition of the downgrade. We're not as holy, we're not as pure, we're not as pristine. That's one angle. Another angle is we're simply not as strong. And because we're not, in other words, since we're not spiritually the way we should be, so we were also weakened. And that's why you see that there was a diminishment in the, what's the word I'm looking for, in the human lifespan. And that's why we became weak, and became weak. We need more protein, and therefore we can eat the meat. So that is the perspective that says that it's a downgrade. Then we said that there's the Kabbalistic view. The Kabbalistic view is that the opposite is true. Not only is it not a downgrade, it's actually a spiritual upgrade. Why? Because eating meat is not a privilege. It's a privilege too. But eating meat is a responsibility. If you're going to eat something, it means you're able to elevate it to your level. So eating a vegetable is not so hard because a vegetable is not so, it's not so coarse in some sense. So to elevate a vegetable, it's not as difficult as elevating meat. Elevating meat, the meat is much more pleasurable. It makes a person feel more animalistic to consume another living being. And to be able to elevate that experience is much harder. The Talmud says someone who is an ignoramus, but it doesn't just mean someone who doesn't know the law. It means someone who's insensitive to spirituality should not eat meat. Why? Because eating meat, if I'm eating meat, it's it's a spiritual statement. It's a statement that I am now going to elevate the energy of the meat. And instead of the meat pulling me down and making me more animalistic, I'm going to elevate that energy and make the animal more human. And therefore, and then make the human more godly. Because everybody has to elevate, right? We have the four levels. We have the mineral, we have the vegetation, we have the animal, we have the human. And the human is not necessarily on the top of the food chain. I mean, it is in the creations, but the point is, I elevate myself and become godly? And everybody has to, every class, every form of life supports the higher form of life. And the human being elevates what is below him and elevates himself and makes it divine and makes it godly. So from the Kabbalistic perspective, if God says now you can eat meat, what that means is now you have the power to elevate the meat and to raise it above, the level of just a living being and making it part of the human being, which the human being is about transcendence. While the cow just wants to eat lunch, the human being wants to transcend himself, and taking the animal, the energy of the animal, and making it human, I teach the animal to transcend. So that's mystically speaking. Mystically speaking, elevation. The Kabbalah is all about elevating the sparks of godliness, and every form of life has a different type of spark of godliness. And therefore, in short, what we're saying is that the ability to the permission to eat meat is a sign of a spiritual upgrade. Adam and Eve were not able to do this. They were too pristine. They were too spiritual. They weren't able to get down into the trenches and elevate the meat. The meat would have pulled them down. At Noach, on the other hand, things change. So that is the perspective that the eating of the meat is in fact something that is the allowance to eating of the meat that that Noach receives is a spiritual upgrade. Go ahead, Vicky.
I have a question. Does it mean that we have to eat meat according to Kabbalah? What happened to those who bypass this step in the food chain and just still eat vegetables?
So that's a tricky, touchy question. I don't know. I'm not sure I know how to answer that question. There's no mitzvah to eat meat. There's no mitzvah to eat meat in the Torah, except in a holy occasion. So, for example, there's a mitzvah to eat meat in the context of an offering, right? So Passover offering, you have a commandment to eat the meat. right? So in other words, it seems like the Torah is saying when it's a holy setting, it's easier to, what is a commandment? Okay, let's start from the beginning. What is a commandment? A commandment is everybody has to do it. If everybody has to do it, means everybody could do it, right? Eating meat is not something that everybody could do every day, spiritually speaking. It takes a great spiritual effort. So there's no commandment to eat meat for dinner every day or for lunch every day. There is a commandment. There is a commandment that on certain circumstances, if you're going to bring an offering to God, like a Passover offering, you should eat the meat. Now, what does that mean? Somebody asks, what if you're a vegan? We'll get to that in a second. So, but the question is it a commandment? It's not a commandment. It's only a commandment in the context of the offering. Certain offerings you have to bring and you have to eat. The only one I could think of that an individual must eat, maybe I'm wrong, but it is the Pesach offering, right? Other offerings, even if I offer them, I can give it to my family, I give it to my grandmother, I can give it to other people. It doesn't say I have to consume it. But Pesach offering, everybody has to eat, right? So that's, I think, the only mitzvah that I can think of. I'm probably missing something, but it's not a commandment because a commandment means everybody has to do it, means everybody could do it at any time, and we're not necessarily sure. There is a mitzvah to honor the Shabbos and holiday with good food and fish and meat, right? So what is that telling you? That's telling you that in the weekday, you're not as spiritual. It's not as easy to elevate the meat. And therefore, we're not going to say across the blanket, everyone should go eat meat every day. But Shabbat, because we are on a more spiritual level and the energy in the world is more spiritual, so therefore, we say there's more of a mitzvah to eat them. It's not a mitzvah as in the 613 commandments. The mitzvah is to honor Shabbos, but the tradition is you honor Shabbos with meat and fish. So the point here is that the more spiritual we are, the more it's an obligation. Now, what if you are vegan? Okay, so I have nothing. I'm not gonna, how do I say this in a nice way? From the Kabbalistic perspective, meat has to be consumed, right? There is a class of creations in the world that have to be elevated. Meat has to be consumed. If the meat would not be consumed from the Kabbalistic perspective, we're missing something because we need the energy of the animal to be uplifted to the human. Everything in the world descends in order to ascend. Everything has to become godly. And the only way the animal could become godly, the animal can't do a mitzvah. The only way the animal could become godly is if the animal becomes part of the man, the human being, and the human being transcends himself and connects to God. And that's how all the lower forms of life also become godly. So according to the master plan of the universe, meat has to be consumed. That's not a question. Does that mean that I as an individual have to eat meat? Not necessarily, right? It's possible that that's not the spiritual path of my soul. It's possible that for me, as an individual, I don't have to eat meat. That is possible. So you have permission. If anybody doesn't want to eat meat, go speak to your doctor, speak to your ethicist, speak to your rabbi, speak to your Kabbalist. Maybe they'll give you a pass that you don't have to eat meat. But if you're asking me as a conceptual concept, does meat have to be consumed by the human beings? From the Kabbalistic perspective, the answer is clearly yes, because that's a step. That's how the meat, that's how the animal is elevated, and everything in this world has to be elevated, including the human being. The way the human being is elevated is you give yourself over to God, not physically, but you give up your energy, you give up your time, you submit, you give over your will. Will is soul. In Hebrew, your soul and your will is the same word. Nafshi could be my soul, could be my will. So if I give my soul, my will to God, I want to do something else, but you know what? I'll do what God wants. That is an act of submission. That is an act of transcendence. That's how I elevate myself, but not only myself, everything that I ate. That's the mineral kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom. Everything is elevated, and of course, the human being. Everything is elevated to the holy, to the higher level. So again, from the cap. Go ahead.
That's in case if it's eaten with the proper intention. And also, I have a question about the word that's used. It translated shall eat. So is it must, or this is could, or this is like neutral?
Here it's could. Here it's could. Usually in the Hebrew is a big problem. It's very hard to differentiate between you have to, you can, or you shall. You may or you have to. Very hard to differentiate. So you have to know from the context. But here it will be for you for food. I think here it's a little weaker. So here it's probably not you have to. But any Hebrew word, you have to think about the context, because, for example, the mitzvah to eat food and then bless, v'achalta, could be translated, you will eat or you have to eat. V'savata, you will be satisfied or you should be satisfied or you can be satisfied. Ubeirachta, and you should bless. You have to bless God. So it's the same form. Same form. So eating is not an obligation. Being satiated is also not an obligation. But blessing is the obligation. But the same form is used. V'achalta, you will eat. V'savata, you will be satisfied. Ubeirachta, you will bless. So is it a story that if you want this to happen, this could happen? It's you have permission, or is it you have to, right? So it's hard to know. In other words, it's hard to know from the word itself. Like I said, this example, the first two words are, you have permission, you could eat, you could be satisfied, but then it says you have to eat. So, but here it's a little bit weaker. Here it says, all the living things will be to you for food. It doesn't say the verb. It doesn't say you should eat it, right? Lachem yiyeh, to you it will be le'achla, to food, right? So it's a little bit weaker. So I wouldn't say it's an obligation. So it's not an obligation, but like I said, spiritually speaking, it's an obligation, not necessarily on the person, but on humanity. In other words, the animal kingdom has to be elevated. Maybe it's not my own path. Maybe for me, my spiritual path is not to eat it. And Vicky is right. We just addressed it last week, that many times when people eat the meat, it lowers them down. But ultimately, in other words, the whole world it works that way. There's risk. We come into this world, we have to elevate, but in the process, we may get pulled down in the meantime. But ultimately, the belief is that we'll get our act together, and then when we return to God, we elevate everything that we have, that's everything that is part of us, even if in the meantime we took a step down, but then when we go up, we pull everything back up with us. So it's like you take a step back to take a step forward. So in the short term, as in for 6,000 years, in other words, in the short term in history, the human being doesn't always advance. But ultimately, when the human being does self-correct, it corrects everything that came in before, and it corrects all the steps back, so to speak, if that makes sense. Yes.
Thank
Go ahead.
So once something, my understanding is once something becomes custom among the Jewish people, it's sort of tantamount to an obligation.
Right.
As such, I don't think it's written any place that we have to cover our heads with the yarmulke.
Correct.
However, since maybe the 16th century, it's been done, so it's become our minhag.
Right.
And it's thus obligatory. Could you say the same thing about consuming meats on certain days or as part of a dietary habit?
So Steve is asking that because in Judaism we have the notion that things become a minhag, things become a custom, and once it's a custom, it becomes an obligation. So it became a custom to eat fish and meat on Shabbat. You read it in all the songs, all the zmirot, all the songs that have been composed of that honoring the Shabbat. It mentions eating good food and eating meat and eating fish. So why does that not become the custom? Why is that not an obligation? I think the answer would be is because built into the rule is it has to be for pleasure, right? So what happens if somebody, I don't like meat. It's not a philosophical thing. I just don't like meat. I don't like it. So then you said, is there an obligation to eat meat if I don't enjoy it, if it makes me sick? The answer is no. Because the custom is to honor the Shabbos with good food. This is how you do it. What happens if as an individual, you don't enjoy this food? Then eating it on Shabbos would be counterproductive, because not only does it bring you tainug, not only does it bring you pleasure, but the contrary, it harms you. And therefore, on Shabbat, you wouldn't have to eat it. You probably would not be allowed to eat it, right? That's, by the way, the reason why you're allowed to. There is this custom. There was this notion that people had a bad dream. I don't suggest you try this at home. But there is this notion, there was this, I don't want to call it a superstition because it's in the halacha, but there is this notion that if people had a bad dream, they would say, that's a sign from God that I have to repent. And the custom was, they call it Tanit Chalom. You have a bad dream at night, the next day you wake up in the morning and you fast. And that's what people like to do. That's what people like to do. The problem is, what happens if you had a bad dream on Friday night? So you want to fast, but you can't fast on Shabbat. So what do? So the answer is, because if you would eat on Shabbat, it would cause you pain, you have to fast on Shabbat. You're allowed to fast on Shabbat. If you do fast on Shabbat, you then have to fast another day of the week to atone for the fact that you didn't eat on Shabbat. But that's beside the point, right? So the point here is that we let you fast because for you, if we would force you to eat, it would cause you pain. But that's a sin that you didn't eat. So therefore, you have to atone for that itself. But what I'm trying to get at here is, if a person who eats food and that food does not bring pleasure, but that food brings pain, so then you don't eat it because it's counterproductive. So in other words, the purpose is in the halacha, the minhag, the purpose is not necessarily to eat the meat. The purpose is to get the pleasure. So if I'm an individual, which I don't like meat, for whatever reason, then I don't have the obligation to eat meat. But again, spiritually, the Kabbalah works a little bit different than the halacha. According to the Kabbalah, if all of us stop eating meat, that's a problem. From the Kabbalistic perspective, does that mean as an individual I have the obligation to eat meat? Not necessarily. Yeah.
But there's also the idea that there could be a neshama trapped in there, and that's the other reason to release it. And there's a midrash with that of a boy who wouldn't eat it, and his father was supposed to be, or grandfather neshama was supposed to be in there.
Yeah. So then there's a different thing of Gilgulim. That's already beyond the scope of my knowledge. You have Gilgulim, you have reincarnation, that you have the souls of the righteous, souls of people could be reincarnated in animals, and by eating it, you elevate it. This is getting a little mystical, but that is correct. I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm saying, but even barring that, even without that, the Kabbalistic notion of we have to elevate the lower forms of life. And eating it, it's not an act of dominance. In other words, it is if you're not eating it properly. But if you're eating it properly, it's an act of elevation. There's mystical truth. Yeah. But you're right, Elisa. There is an idea of Gilgulim. There's the idea of that there could be reincarnation of souls into animals, and that's how when you eat it, you elevate it. But like I said, that's a little bit beyond the scope of my knowledge. But yes, the notion does exist. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Hang on just a second, Vicky. Go ahead.
No, so my question is, so if the only way that we can elevate the sparks that are in the plants and in animals is if we eat them,
yeah,
then it seems like there's a fair amount of pressure that we should
eat a lot.
And then at the same time, that's very contrary to preserving the earth and everything related to that. And so what's the
balance?
And so what happens to all the things that we just really can't eat?
Right. So that's the balance.
We'll never be able to eat everything.
So the Kabbalah explains like this. So Amy's concern is, if I have to eat every last animal to be able to elevate every last animal, then first of all, I'll get a tummy ache. And second of all, the world can't sustain it. If I have to eat every last vegetable to elevate it, there'll be no more food in this earth.
And
so
how could this be? How could we can't?
It's impossible. Correct. So the Kabbalistic answer is as follows. The Kabbalistic answer is you don't have to elevate the whole pile to elevate the whole pile. In other words, for example, charity. You make a paycheck. You give 10% of money to charity or whatever, a smaller, however much you give, that elevates all the money you earned. You have an offering. You bring an offering to God, a carbon. That offering represents all the energy of the chai, all the energy of the animal kingdom. And therefore, elevating one, it represents elevating the species. So it doesn't necessarily break down that I have to elevate everything. Because if you look at the Torah, always the Torah says, do a mitzvah, not with all of your possessions, do with a small part of your possessions. It's always a small part. Even in the morning, you're supposed to pray. How much do you pray? Pray a whole day? No, pray a few minutes. But that few minutes elevates the whole day. You have to make challah. You have to donate a part to the priest. How much? A very small portion of the dough. But that small portion, it's not just to say that only the part that I elevate that I separate is holy. Only the part that I give to the priest is holy. No, the part that I give to the priest represents the elevation of the entire batter, the entire batch, because part of it has been elevated. And therefore, even the part that I consume becomes holy. So the same is true about everything in this world, that when we take a portion of the creation and we elevate it, that is elevating all the species. So you ask me, well, so to bring once in your lifetime, why do you have to eat meat every day? I don't know. I don't know the answer. I don't know how this breaks down. But you see in the offerings, it says once a day, once in the morning, once in the afternoon. Now, you don't have to eat meat every day. But again, like I said, I'm not a Kabbalist. I can't tell you how much meat you should eat and how you should eat it. But what I could tell you is that Kabbalistically, there's a notion that eating of the meat represents the ability to elevate the animal, and that represents an upgrade over what Adam had. Adam was not able to eat the meat. Like I said, there's two ways to read the story. One way to read the story is it's a downgrade because the flood, because of the flood, and because of the deterioration that we left Eden, and we're not on the state of Adam and Eve, and therefore now we're allowed to eat meat because the human being is so animalistic. If you're not going to let him eat meat, he's going to kill he's going to eat it. He's going to become a cannibal and eat another person, right? That's one way to look at it. So it's a sort of a concession to human nature. And that's one way to look at it. But the Kabbalistic way to look at it is the opposite. What Adam and Eve could not do now, chapter 9, verse 3 says, and verse 3 says you could do. Now everything is given to your hands. Now you have the ability to elevate and all forms of life. And the way you do it is by consumption, but again, consumption for a holy purpose. And you get into the details. It doesn't necessarily, there's different levels of, I don't want to get too far into the Kabbalah here. There's different levels. One level, the higher level is while you're eating, you are aware and you're mindful of the soul of the food that you're elevating. That's a higher level. But there's a lower level that also works. And that is if your food you're eating is kosher, you could eat it. And you don't even have to have great intention and great mindfulness while you eat it. But if you're then going to take that energy and do something good, you're going to do a mitzvah with that energy, then automatically you elevate everything that fueled you, and that energy of the animal is elevated even if you have not been mindful. So it's better if you're mindful because it's more direct. If you're not mindful, then what happens is it takes the dip. If you're not mindful, then for a moment, the energy goes down. But then when you do the mitzvah with that energy, then you uplift it. So without getting into the details, even if I ate a hamburger, I ate a piece of steak, and I wasn't mindful. By the way, Shabbat, you don't have to be mindful, right? The mitzvah of Shabbat, eating it on Shabbat itself is the mitzvah. I don't have to think about it. I'm being mindful. I'm elevating. Just the pleasure on Shabbat itself is a mitzvah. And even if it's Sunday night and you want to barbecue, not tonight because today's the fast day, but next week, 4th of July, you want to make a barbecue because that's your minhag. Even if you're not meditating while you're eating the sandwich, I suggest you do. Don't get me wrong. I suggest you do. But even if you don't, but then you take that energy and you do something good. You've studied something in the Torah. You do a mitzvah. You say you're nice to somebody next to you. What happens is then you're elevating the energy, not only of yourself, but also of the food that you consume.
Well, Rabbi, first of all, I feel bad talking about it on Saturday, but it's the morning. It's early in the morning. So I don't feel that bad. But you kind of partially answered my question. But can we understand it that could conditionally? So if you do elevate it, if you somehow manage to elevate it, at least from your point of view, then you could eat it. But if it pulls you down, you shouldn't.
Yeah, it's not a mitzvah. It's not an obligation. Anytime when something is a permission, it means obligation means I have to do it. If I have to do it, it means I have the power to do it. If something is permission, it means it's conditional. It's conditional. If this is right for you right now, do it. If not, then you don't have to. If you don't have to, means, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Why is today a fast day? Today's a fast day because it's the 17th of Tammuz. It commemorates the beginning of the period of the destruction of the temple. The temple was destroyed on the 9th of Av, which is exactly 3 weeks from today. And 3 weeks before that, the walls of Jerusalem were breached by the Romans. The 17th of Tammuz, they breached the walls of Jerusalem. And that's why we fast today. And that is the beginning of the 3-week mourning period. Of the 3-week mourning period, the last 9 days, not last 9 days is the most intense mourning. And that's when people don't engage in things of pleasure, like going swimming. But that's the last 9 days. And eating meat, by the way, most Ashkenazim, I believe, don't eat meat for 9 days. Sephardim eat meat just don't eat meat in the week before Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. So we're a little bit longer. We're 3 weeks, I think. No, we're 9 days. And so that's the commemoration of today. So, but I'm going to try to connect it to the verses we're going to read. So we'll see if we can do that, because everything has to fit somehow. Everything is interconnected. Okay, verse 4 is a fascinating verse. We touched upon it last week, but we didn't touch about the spiritual meaning or the ethical meaning or the moral meaning. Verse 4, but flesh with its soul, its blood you shall not eat. So the Torah just told you you can eat the flesh of the animal. What can't you do? You cannot eat the flesh of the animal when the soul of the animal is still in the animal. And we discussed last week, that's called Ever Minachai. That's called taking a limb from a living being. We said last week, I know it's early in the morning, but it's not a little gory, but in the ancient world, this was common practice because there's no refrigeration. If you kill an animal, you have to eat the whole animal in one day, otherwise it's going to spoil. And if you don't have your extended family or your tribe, you can't waste the full animal on one day. So what you would do is you would tear a limb from the animal, eat a part of that animal, and then leave the animal alive and then continue eating it over time. Of course, terrible pain for the animal, and that is a sin. You're not allowed to eat the animal, a limb of the animal, when the animal is still alive. If you want to eat the animal, you have to kill the animal first. That is the mitzvah. That is the commandment. One of the 7 Noahide laws is seven of the 7 Noahide laws, which is in the broader context, it's about cruelty for animals. By the way, it's Sunday. We have to connect it to the parsha. I saw a beautiful talk from the Rebbe yesterday. The Rebbe said like this: if you read the story of Bilam is going to curse the Jews when God told him not to. So God sends the angel to stand in his way 3 times. And 3 times he hits his animal. And finally, the donkey starts talking. And finally, the angel starts talking. And the angel rebukes Bilam. And what does the angel tell Bilam? I would expect the angel to say, why are you going to curse the Jews when God told you that you should not go to curse Jews? God said you can go, but God said you have to go, but you're not going to be able to curse them. And you're going with the intention to curse the Jews. So why are you going? So you would expect the rebuke to be, why are you defying God? What is the actual, in actuality, what is the rebuke? Does anybody know? What is the rebuke? He says, why did you hit your animal 3 times? I mean, okay, you shouldn't be hitting your animal, but if you want to compare hitting your animal to defying God, I would expect that if the angel finally will appear to Bilam and give him rebuke and say, why are you defying God? Say, why are you defying God? Hitting the animal seems like a small point in the story. The Rebbe says no. The Rebbe says that highlights the importance of this commandment, which is not to cause pain to animals, that in some sense it's even more important. It's even a bigger sin than defying God, is causing pain to God's creatures. And that's why the angel does not rebuke Bilam and saying, why are you defying God? Instead, he says, why did you hit your animal? So that's interesting and related to what we're about to read here. So that's fun. Okay, so what are we getting at? We're getting at you cannot eat so verse 4, you want to eat the animal, it's fine, but you have to kill the animal first. So the simple conventional interpretation is this is simply a way to make sure that we don't cause pain to animals. Okay, but the question becomes, is there a moral and ethical teaching here? And the answer is that yes. And some of the commentaries explain as follows. They say, look, what is the Torah telling you? I'm going to excuse myself just 1 second. I apologize. Hello? Ken. In exactly 20 minutes. Okay, אני באמצע שיעור. אני אדבר איתך עוד 20 דקות. בסדר? Bye-bye. Chani's at camp, and the kids are anxious to go, so they're calling me, but I think I reassured them. Okay, so what's happening now? Oh, so what's the big idea here? The big idea here is don't cause pain to animals. Is there something deeper? Yes, there's something deeper. What is the Torah telling you? The Torah is telling you, you may eat the animal, the body of an animal, but you cannot eat the soul of the animal. Why not? If you have to elevate the animal, why can't you elevate the soul? Okay. So one interpretation, this is from Rabbi Shamshin here, she says a very interesting concept. He says, there's nothing wrong for us to consume the body of the animal. There's no moral problem. There's no philosophical, theological, moral problem. The problem becomes if we consume the animal of the soul of the soul of the animal. Why? Because then we think we become like the soul of the animal. And the truth is, our body is very similar to the animal's body, but our soul is very different than the animal's soul. And if we're allowed to consume the animal soul, in other words, consume the animal when its soul is still in the flesh, that means when it's still alive, that would mean that we could internalize the soul of the animal. And that's a danger. We cannot internalize the soul of the animal. Why not? What's happening here? So the body of the animal is simple. The body is physical. We're physical. We have a body. The animal has a body. That's not really the difference between a human being and the animal is the body, right? Our DNA is what, 98% the same, maybe more. Okay. So there's no danger for us to consume the body of an animal. The soul of the animal, however, that would be dangerous because there's a tremendous difference between the soul of the animal and the soul of the human being. What is that? The soul of the animal is not free. In other words, it gives life to the animal, but it doesn't have free choice. It cannot transcend its instincts. If the instincts of the animal are to do something, that's what it's going to do. Now, if we view ourselves as part of the jungle, we're part of the animal kingdom, and therefore we can consume and we can assimilate the soul of the animal as part of us. That would mean that the soul of the animal is internalized within us. What's the soul of the animal? The soul of the animal is the soul, the life. It's life, but it's sort of trapped and sort of serves the body. It cannot transcend what the body wants. It cannot transcend instinct. If we were to eat the soul of the body, the soul of the animal, that would represent that we're close enough to the soul of the animal that the soul of the animal could give us life, can give us sustenance. What the Torah is telling you is you may not eat the flesh. If you read this in Hebrew, ach basar b'nafsho damo. You cannot eat the flesh when the soul is still in the blood, because we cannot consume the animal. We cannot consume the soul of the animal, because our soul is completely different than the soul of the animal. The soul of the animal, like I said, is trapped to instinct, and the soul of the human being is free. The soul of the human being is able to transcend instinct. And the big danger, the moral danger, is if we define ourselves as an animal. If the human being defines himself as a sophisticated animal, but an animal in the sense that ultimately I cannot transcend my instinct. If that's the case, I deteriorate. Ultimately, there'll be another flood. Ultimately, people would not be able to create civilization, because to create civilization, you have to overcome your instincts. And the biggest moral danger would be if I feel that I'm like an animal, I cannot control my instincts. So it's actually even more important to highlight that when we're allowed to consume the body of the animal, Torah has to say, look, the body of the animal you can consume, because your body is not that different than the body of the animal. So you could it could become part of you. It could become part of your nutrition. It could become part of your bloodstream. But the soul of the animal, God forbid to allow the soul of the animal to enter you, because then you may get the idea that you are the soul of the animal, and in reality, you're a completely different species in the sense that soul of the animal is trapped to instinct. Soul of the human being has to transcend. Now, with getting a little, I mentioned this last week after the recording turned off. There is a theory that sort of in between. Remember, I said there's a spectrum of, is it good to eat meat or is it bad to eat meat? So I said one interpretation is it's bad, it's a downgrade. The other Kabbalistic interpretation is it's an upgrade, because now we have the ability to elevate the meat. In between, there's another perspective, and the other perspective makes an argument like that, like this, the following argument. Really, it would be bad. It's not a good idea to eat meat. But God saw, and that's why, even once the Torah, if you want to track the pattern, first God says no meat at all. That's to Adam. Then comes to Noah, God says eat meat. But then to Moses in the Torah, God says you could eat meat, but there's all kinds of restrictions. There's the laws of shechita, the laws of ritual slaughter, which today they can mass produce kosher meat. But in the olden days, you weren't able to mass produce the kosher meat because you weren't able to mass produce. So it limited how much meat you could eat because you needed the expertise to slaughter the animal. So it basically regulated, and if it regulated, it limited it. So if you follow the pattern, In the beginning, it says no meat. Then it says, okay, you could eat meat. And then once again, it's limited. So what is the sort of the middle interpretation say? It says, really, we shouldn't be eating meat. It's an act of cruelty, whatever the case is. Ask the vegetarians, they'll explain to you why we shouldn't be eating meat. However, God saw that because we didn't eat meat, there was a moral danger. What's the moral danger? The moral danger is we did not realize that we are superior to the animals. We viewed ourselves as too close to the animals. So therefore, God, after the flood, has to say, you're not an animal. How do I know? And therefore, to show that, you say, you're allowed to eat the animal. Every form of life could consume the lower form of life. So if we were not able to consume the animal, we would think we're on the same level. If we're on the same, okay, we're more sophisticated. We can get to Mars. We can create an iPhone. But in conceptually, we're the same. We're just a little more advanced, but we're the same category. And if that's the case, you get to spiritual danger. The spiritual danger means I'm an animal. The animal can't control its instincts. I cannot control mine. So God says, you know what? I'd rather you eat meat, even though it's a negative, but to make the point that you're not an animal, you can transcend, unlike the animal. And then once God makes that point, when it comes to Moses, comes to the Torah, God says, you know what? Let's regulate it to limit it. So that's sort of the middle ground. Right? So we have the full spectrum. We have either it's downgrade, or it's an upgrade, or it's sort of in between. But consistent with the middle point is the point that if you can, before we do that, by the way, that there's another interpretation also, who says this? Somebody else, a contemporary person says this. He says, look at the ark. The ark, you had the ark of the flood. You had the ark that Noah built, Noah's ark. You had 3 stories. You had the bottom was for the food and for the garbage, for the waste. The middle floor was for the animals. Top floor was for the human being. So one interpretation is that's the main point of the whole ark, to tell the human being you're not an animal. You get your own story. That is the ethical teaching of the flood. That's the ethical teaching of the ark, that we're superior to the animal. What does it mean superior? Not that we're better and we're stronger, but it means we have a moral superiority in the sense that we're not trapped to the body. We could transcend. So consistent with this idea is the idea that you can eat the body, but you cannot eat the soul. Why? Because the soul, if you consume the soul, if you internalize the soul, that would be morally dangerous. Go ahead. Yeah.
So, correct me if I'm wrong. At the point of death, the human being, the soul departs the body. Not so for an animal. According to this, or only partially, because there's still part of the soul left in the animal at the point of death.
Right. So there's certainly the animal has a soul. Certainly, according to the Kabbalah, every creation has a soul. Not just the living animal, not just the vegetation, but even the stone. According to the Kabbalah, everything has a spark of God that is bringing it into existence. So there certainly is a soul, not just to the animal, but also to the vegetable, and also to the even to the stone. That's what the Arizal writes. Having said that, there's a difference between the type of energy, between the type of soul. And the animal soul is a wonderful soul, but it doesn't have that notion of freedom. The animal is a lot of things. It's very loyal, man's best friend. It's all kinds of good, holy qualities. But what it doesn't have freedom, moral freedom. And the whole idea of the Torah is predicated on the fact that we, the human being, we're free. What does it mean we're free? It means that we have moral freedom. We're not trapped by our instincts. That's why the idea of freedom is so critical to the Torah. That's why the idea of freedom is the idea of the Exodus of Egypt, the freedom. We're free people. God makes us free, is embedded within our religion every single day, multiple times a day. We mention it. It's not just history. It's the most important thing we could tell a person is you're free. What does it mean you're free? Doesn't mean doesn't mean you have no limitations. You have limitations that come about because of the body. You have physical limitations. But what you don't have is you don't have limitations on your moral choice. And that the animal does have. And that means that not that the animal doesn't have a soul, but that the soul of the animal and the soul of the human being is a different category. It's a total different level. Even though everything has a spark of God, like I said, not only the animal, but also even the inanimate, according to the Kabbalah.
I understand the difference.
Yeah.
Well, my question is, at the point of death of the animal, the soul has not left the animal, as opposed to the human being.
With the human being also, it's a human being is also there's 5 levels of the soul. The lowest level of the soul, the nefesh, stays in the grave, according to the Kabbalah, because the lowest level of the soul's job is to give vitality to the body. That's its job. So once the body dies, that function of the soul no longer serves anything, right? there's no body in heaven for that part of the soul to go back to heaven for. So that according to the Kabbalah, the nefesh remains in the grave. And we studied it in the JLI, in the most recent JLI. That's why, according to the Kabbalah, when you go to the gravesite of a loved one, you're interacting with that person's nefesh, the lowest part of that soul. The nefesh then ascends to heaven and awakens the deeper parts of the soul. And that's how you have that, and that connects you to the higher parts, but it goes through the nefesh. The nefesh is sort of an intermediary to the different parts of the soul. I would argue the same things with the animal, that there's the part of the animal that gives life to the animal that remains in the physical realm.
Rabbi Feldman,
Go ahead.
I just want to make sure that I got my answer from last week where I was trying to understand that the purpose of allowing to consume the animal is to understand that there is a difference and there are some exceptions. So, and if we like understand verse 3, verse 4 and 5 together, that will kind of give us the whole concept why, the whole context. Because first of all, you have to rule over the beast. Then you can consume, however, you have to understand the difference between the soul of the animal and the soul of human being. So everything has to be in a context. And I think that kind of answers the question I had from last week.
I think so. I think it's the full balance. We have the full balance. I agree. Okay, we have just a few minutes left because I got to end on time because the kids want to go to the camp. They gave me a permission. They said, look, you could study Torah for an hour, but not much more than an hour. In any case, so I want to get to a very interesting point that probably could relate to the fast day as well. But once God says, okay, you could eat the animal, the body of the animal. Then he says you could eat the animal, but you cannot eat the soul of the animal. Now he says, but you can kill an animal. Now he says you can't kill a human being. Because again, remember, we're talking to an audience where we have to explain that a human being and an animal is not the same category. So if you're going to say you're allowed to eat every living being, does that include a human being? He says, no, you cannot include a human being. And that's what you have verse 5 and verse 6. Verse 5 and 6, however, your blood, which belongs to your souls, I will demand. Of every beast will I demand it. In other words, but of every man, for that of his brother, I will demand the soul of man. In other words, God will punish somebody who takes the soul of man. Not only will God punish a human being, God will also punish the beast who takes the soul of man. So if an animal takes the soul of man, God will punish that animal. But if a human being kills somebody, God will punish them as well. God will demand the blood, which represents God will punish them. But if God's demanding, it's because you demand. Ed Rosh, to demand means you demand something that belongs to you. If I take away your wallet, you'll demand it back from me. If I take away someone's life, God will demand that person's life from me. What is demand? Demand means you demand something that's yours. Soul of man, the soul of life doesn't be, the soul of man does not belong to man. The soul of man belongs to God. Okay. And then you have a very interesting verse 6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. In other words, even though in the verse 5, we said that if a person kills his fellow, God will punish them. But here he says you can't rely on God. The human court has to punish the murderer with a capital punishment, right? Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. The human being has to avenge the blood of the murderer, of the person murdered. And here we have something very interesting. Here we have the explanation. Why is murder so terrible? For in the image of God, he made man. God made man in the image of God. So if you're going to kill a human being, in some sense, you are diminishing the image of God, because we're in the image of man. The animal is not in the image of man. So if you kill an animal, you're not diminishing the image of God. But because the human being is in the image of God, if you kill a human being, you're diminishing the image of God.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
I got another addendum to this.
Yes.
When you talk about if you're killing someone, then you're killing, the part of the image of God. Also, it says when you slander somebody, spread rumors and gossip, that's worse than murder, because with murder, it's over. But the gossip and the slander continues on. So there has to be some type of recognition that you're also tarnishing or hurting God. Is that correct?
Yeah. It says that slander is like murder, because here you see the murder is referred to as spilling of blood. And when you anytime you humiliate somebody, you embarrass them, so they turn white. So in some sense, blood recedes from the face. That's considered spilling of the blood in a metaphoric sense. So in some sense, that's just as bad. And therefore, the Talmud says that humiliating somebody else is in some sense it's like murder, and it uses this verse. Okay, what changes here? We know that we read here that God saw man. God creates man in the image of God, but we already said it. We already said it in the story of creation. So Rabbi Sachs wrote about this a lot, but he probably took it from Rabbi Shamshon Paul Hirsch, who says what's interesting here is that this is the first time where the Torah says as follows. The Torah says you cannot kill somebody else because the other person was made in the image of God. In other words, teaching you to see the image of God in the other person, not just in yourself, right? Here, this is a reason to interact with somebody else. And that's why if you look at verse 5, and I missed it, but what's the most important part of this verse 5? However, your blood which belongs to your souls I will demand. Of every beast will I demand it. But of every man for that of his brother, I will demand the soul of man. So what's the most important verse? Important part of the verse? Not that God will punish the person who murders. No, that's not the most important point. The most important point is from the hand of his brother. The most important point is the fellow human being is your brother. And that is something was never articulated yet. I mean, you can deduce it from the fact that we were all created in the image of God. But in the beginning of the story, it says Adam was created in the image of God. Wow, wonderful. It's my yichus. It's my lineage. I feel very good about myself. I'm created in the image of God. What do we say here? Yes, of course you were created in the image of God. But by extension, that means that your fellow human being is your brother because he too was created in the image of God. And that is something that we get after the flood. And that's something that was not necessarily understood in the times of Adam. People looked at themselves. They understood they have a certain relationship with God, but they were not used to seeing the image of God within their fellow. And that's what happens after the flood. After the flood is murder becomes a problem because you have to understand that God will demand the blood from the brother. What's the most important point here? The most important point is your fellow is your brother. And why? Because God created, doesn't say your brother, but that's the context. God created the other one in the image of God. And therefore you can't kill the other person. So here we're using that term not to explain to the person himself his own value, but we're using that term created in the image of God to explain to you the other person's value. We have a minute or two left. I want to connect this to the fast day. So Kabbalistically speaking, they breached the walls of Jerusalem. So what's the big deal of breaching the walls of Jerusalem? So you say, well, that's the way they had warfare in those days. You fortified the city. That's how you stayed protected. And then if you want to break into the city, if you want to conquer the city, you have to break into the city. So that's the breaching of the walls. But mystically speaking, breaching of the walls has a mystical meaning, and the mystical meaning is as follows. And this the Hasidic philosophy talks about on the 10th of Tevis, which is the day the siege was laid on Jerusalem. So the siege was laid on Jerusalem. So that was a terrible tragedy. In some sense, it's the worst. Halachically, in some sense it's the worst. It's the worst fast because the 10th of Tammuz, because it's the beginning of the problem. And the beginning of the problem really includes everything. So what the Hasidic teachings explain is why does God create this idea that the beginning of the downfall is that we lay siege. So the siege, what does the siege do for us? So of course, physically it means that there's no food, etc. There's famine. But what it does to us in the positive sense, it reminds us that we're all on the same boat. It reminds us that we're all connected. You can't leave, you can't come. We're all our fate is interconnected. The reason why God does is the reason why the temple was destroyed because of the infighting. So the siege was supposed to remind us that we're all united. That was supposed to increase our unity. And if we would repent and unite with each other, we would be able to overcome the siege. The tragedy was that we didn't take the message of the siege to heart, and therefore the wall was broken. Our protection was broken. But what is our protection? Our protection is the understanding that we're all in this together. And therefore, it's not each man to their own, but each person has to be responsible for the other person. So the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem on the 17th of Tammuz means that was the day that we did not take the message to heart. We did not see ourselves as all within one wall. So if we have to correct it, that's the purpose of fasting. The purpose of fasting is not just mourning. The purpose of mourning is to correct it. The way you correct the breach is by understanding that there's a wall that surrounds us, not us against them. We're all in the same, all of humanity in some sense. I think that's also the lesson of the pandemic, that all of humanity is interconnected. We're all surrounded by the same walls. Our fate is interconnected. So that's really what's happening here. What's happening here is what we just read is you have to see the other person as your friend, as your brother. You have to see the other person as created in the image of God. And that's the lesson of the breached wall. The wall was breached today, and today we have to fortify the wall. And the way we fortify the wall is realize that we're all interconnected, surrounded by the wall. So that's the lesson, and that's how the Torah's teaching, the portion of Noach, relates to today, to the fast day. So good to see everybody, and it's good to be together in the same fortification, either in person or on Zoom, but studying Torah together. That unites us, and that's how we see the image of God, not only in ourselves, but also in our fellow. May we only hear good news and good health.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.